Before we move off the college essay, because it's proven to be so important, this is one of your rare opportunities to show who you really are and kind of package yourself with a hook that sets you apart from other applicants. Is there anything that we haven't covered? Are there any other pieces of advice, or insight, or wisdom that students should know when they're writing their college essay?
Well, I just want to, as a former writer and professional journalist for many years, it's very important for students to start with a lead that is going to be a grabber. And the lead, it could be the first sentence, it could be an anecdote at the beginning of the essay, but don't get to your main point or have your grabber sentence be 2 paragraphs down. A couple of my favorites were, there was a student whose lead was, "I am a girl named Leonard." That Leonard was her name. Leonard was her name. Now, right there, you want to read more. And the whole essay was about her quirky and offbeat family and how they, gave her a life where exploring and looking at life through a different lens was a positive way to be. And she had been named after her grandfather, who had died. And that was a wonderful essay. Another one of my real favorites was a boy who answered a question for Washington and Lee, what was the best advice you ever received? And he said, the best advice I ever received was buy railroads. And guess what his topic was? Monopoly. And he talked about his family's love for sitting around board games and how his dad would test his sister's boyfriends by how well they played Monopoly. So he was able to carry that off because he had a great sense of humor and he could put it across in writing. So at any rate, don't overlook the lead, and you could have a nice little anecdote in the beginning if you've gone abroad, like many students do, to set yourself apart in your essay. Focus on one person you met on your trip, not the whole experience, and how that one person might have changed you. And that could create a powerful essay out of what has become a very commonplace occurrence.
Excellent point. Yeah, and I think that, I'm sorry, before we move on, I think reading other folks' essays, and one of the things that we've been working on at Princeton Review is giving students access to other students' essays that have been successful at some schools and not successful at others, so that you can see some essays that worked in some places, but get a real composite of what that student was, what high school they went to, what the community was like, did they challenge themselves in the classroom, what were their standardized test scores. And I'm teaching a new class online for sort of writing an essay, but it's not me coaching you through an essay, but it's showing you other students that were successful in some places and not successful in others, and then crafting students' essays together and having some practice. I think, Pam, to your point, is that you want to have a strong lead, but you want to be a good writer, and part of that is practice, and practice writing lots of different essays so you get it right once you submit that final essay to a school.
It's also the very first time they've been writing about themselves. So students go to school and they write long papers on history subjects or analyzing a novel, but to actually have to sit down and write about yourself, it's very difficult. We teach our children to be humble and not to brag and not to promote themselves, and then we want them to sit down and write this, exciting thing about them. But a little trick sometimes for students when they're about to write about themselves is to use the first line. This is not the opening hook line or anything, but just to start with, there once was a girl who, or there once was a boy who, and then they kind of tell a story and then eventually connect the dots and it becomes them. But my favorite first line this past year was, my family was green before it was fashionable. And, she talked about all the years of composting and all her neighbors not understanding what they were doing, but they were way ahead of everybody. So anyway.
Also, it's very important that students focus on some way that they were changed or grew through the experience, whatever the experience is you're writing about. And sometimes these essays have almost a confessional quality. One of my absolute favorites was of a young man who had gone to Costa Rica on one of these trips to build houses, and he was a New Yorker, and he went into the host family, and he was staying with the host family, and he was speaking Spanish, and he had a penchant for sarcasm back home in New York. And when he walked in the door of this host family, the first words out of his mouth were in Spanish, "Wow, this is a really ugly house." Now, what he really meant was, this is really a beautiful house, but he was trying to use sarcasm in Spanish, and it didn't work. And he spent the next 2 weeks of his experience trying to dig himself out of a hole with his Spanish host to make her realize that he really did love her and he thought her house was beautiful. And he wrote about this essay, and not just because of his faux pas, but because it was a life-changing experience. When he got back to New York, he started thinking about the way he related to his friends, the way they related to each other, the sarcasm that was rampant, and he changed the way he related to them. He stopped using sarcasm, and at the end he said he actually became funny.
That's
I think there's one more point that should probably be mentioned before we move on, and that is length. It's very important for students to read the instructions, and having a long essay is not necessarily a better essay. And in fact, oftentimes being more concise and leaving out extraneous details, sometimes students, well, we all do this, sometimes we fall in love with our words, right? And they have a hard time editing their essay and making them shorter, but if someone can help them to edit it and take out the parts that really don't drive their story forward, it often turns out to be a better, tighter, overall more effective essay. Instead of looking out and trying to figure out what do they want, look inside and ask yourself, what do I really care about? What do I want?